And I just wanted to make everybody welcome and say thank you for attending. We have a whole series of webinars that we do on a regular basis, and this one's going to be about logging and reporting best practices for Prisma Access. These webinars are posted after the fact, so if you have coworkers, customers, people that you'd like to have watch this after the fact, please have them do so. Also, we will have an opportunity to do some Q&A towards the end of the webinar. There is a Q&A place where you can post questions. We won't go through them as they're asked, but at the end of the webinar, at the end of the session, we'll take some extra time and get a chance to be able to answer any questions that may come up. So, as I said, today we're going to be talking about Prisma Access logging and reporting. Let me kind of detail that a bit for everybody. We're going to begin with Cortex Data Lake. You need Cortex Data Lake. You need to forward your logs from Prisma Access to Cortex Data Lake. And of course, all your other pieces of your Palo Alto Networks platform can also be forwarded to Cortex Data Lake. And we'll take a little look at that. So we'll talk about Cortex Data Lake. We'll talk about forwarding logs out of Cortex Data Lake to other destinations. And of course, how you get Prisma Access to forward logs to Cortex Data Lake. Once we kind of set up the basics there, then we're going to take a look at some of the things that the logs are going to help you with. So we'll talk about viewing logs in Panorama, specifically traffic and global protect logs, and a little bit more about the global protect reporting and logging inside Prisma Access. It's going to be great for your mobile users. We'll visit Prisma Access Insights, which is great for tracking statistics and information about mobile users, and how we can use logs, specifically system logs, for IPsec troubleshooting. And we'll kind of run through some scenarios there. And then we'll spend a few minutes talking about logs in the cloud-based management tool. So this is going to be pretty Panorama-centric, but we will visit a little bit about the cloud-based management tool. I'm going to be switching in and out between some slides here and also a panorama to kind of demonstrate some of the different pieces and parts as we go along. So hopefully everybody will find this interesting and useful. So let's begin. First of all, Cortex Data Lake. As I mentioned, Prisma Access is going to be required to forward their logs to Cortex Data Lake. Cortex Data Lake is our cloud-based logging solution that gives you secure, resilient, fault-tolerant, high available logs that are going to be up to date and, of course, available whenever you need them. The great thing about Cortex Data Lake, as opposed to on-site log storage, is it's scalable and easily scalable. So you don't have to do things like deploy log collectors and size those and buy new ones to extend your log collection durations and number of logs and things like that. It's basically scalable, and you subscribe to it with whatever sort of logging rate and retention sizes that you need. So I mentioned your Prisma Access logs have to be forwarded to Cortex Data Lake, but also other logs from other devices and other pieces of our platform are able to be forwarded to Cortex Data Lake as well. So, in this slide here, we've got our Prisma Access logs being forwarded to Cortex Data Lake, but we also have our physical firewalls and Cortex XDR and VM series firewalls in the cloud that are all forwarding their logs to Cortex Data Lake. Well, this gives you an advantage in that you're going to be able to have all your logs in one spot, easily accessible. Everything can be forwarded from one spot, Cortex Data Lake, to make easy log forwarding decisions. You also have the ability to correlate all of these logs, and it gives you a global view of everything that's going on inside your network. So since you're going to be using Cortex Data Lake for Prisma Access, you may as well leverage it for the other pieces and parts of your Palo Alto Networks platform. Now, unlike forwarding your logs, say, to keeping them on a local firewall or forwarding them to Panorama or something like that, you would always forward the logs from the point where those logs are stored. If they're stored in Cortex Data Lake, even though you might be viewing them through your Panorama that you're using for your Prisma Access deployment, maybe for all of your other components of our platform, the logs are in Cortex Data Lake. So you're going to have to forward the logs from Cortex Data Lake in order to do that. It's very simple to do that. You need to basically create a log forwarding profile within Cortex Data Lake to do that. And I thought I'd just take a moment and show you how simple it is to do that. So one moment here, and let me just pop up Cortex Data Lake. So Cortex Data Lake is part of our hub. It's a cloud-based, the hub is where our cloud-based applications are. So if you think about like a app store, where you're able to get different applications to add to your smartphone or whatever the case may be, our cloud-based applications are all in the hub, which is apps.paloaltonetworks.com. You can subscribe to all these different labs, all these different apps. We're going to take a look at Cortex Data Lake. So in Cortex Data Lake, we have the ability to go to the log forwarding portion of Cortex Data Lake. And we can create log forwarding profiles for syslog or HTTPS logs or even emails. And if you were going to add a log forwarding profile, you simply click Add. You give your log forwarding profile a name, put in the syslog server information about whether it's an IP address or an FQDN, determine what sort of logs you want to forward, and put in a facility that you're going to be using. You can also, of course, do this securely, in which case you're going to need certificates, and you can upload different certificates and things like that. And as an example, if I wanted to do some other type of log forwarding, maybe I want to do email events. I can do that too. I can have recipients and people that I want to copy and blind copy. And I can choose the different log types that I would like to forward. So now if your customer's like, hey, you know, all of my logs have to be on Cortex Data Lake, what if I want to forward them to my own syslog server or a SEM or Splunk or whatever? They would be forwarded from Cortex Data Lake, as opposed to doing it on, say, your Panorama device. Now, when it comes to forwarding logs to Cortex Data Lake, if you're managing your Panorama, your Prisma Access deployment from Panorama, then you're going to need to create a log forwarding profile. This is going to be done under the Objects tab in Panorama. I would suggest you probably do it at a very high level, maybe the shared level. And you want to also check this second box here. The second box that says enable enhanced application logging to Cortex Data Lake, which includes traffic logs, URL filtering logs, etc., which will forward all the different log types there. Now you could make decisions about what levels of alerts and things that you want, but remember, you're not going to be able to see any logs that you are not forwarding Cortex Data Lake. So forward all of them would be the best practice. Another hint or trick I might give you is the log forwarding profile name. In this case, we gave it a explicit name, FW forward to Cortex, FWD to Cortex. If I do that and I create a log forwarding profile, in order to forward logs, I have to add that log forwarding profile on any security policy rule. If I actually name my log forwarding profile default with a lowercase d, so DEF, like Frank, AULT, whenever I create a new security policy rule, that log forwarding profile will automatically be added. If I give it a different, unique name, then I have to go to the pull down. I have to choose that particular log forwarding profile I want to use. So one way to streamline this is to call that log forwarding profile, instead of some unique name, just name it default. Now, the logs that you're going to see in Panorama that have been forwarded to Cortex Data Lake will appear as though they are on Panorama. If they're actually up in Data Lake, we're fetching them. And I wanted to kind of look at some of the logs that you're going to see. This is an example of traffic logs. And when you're using Prisma Access, there's a couple things that are a bit different and unique when it comes to viewing the traffic logs. One of the things is that when you're looking at the zones, the from zone and the to zone, the from zone and the to zone are going to be a bit different than they are with an on-premise firewall or any other type of firewall that we have, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud or things like that. But unique to Prisma Access is the from zone when we are looking at traffic from remote networks. So let's take this scenario here, where we have traffic here on the left coming from a remote network that we call remote network B. And let's say that there's a user here in the remote network, a client here, that is talking to somebody over in remote network B at another branch office. I'm sorry, remote network A. You would typically see whatever zone or a zone name for remote network B going to some zone in remote network A. When it comes to Prisma Access, it's slightly different. What we would see is actually for the from zone or the source zone, we're going to see whatever we named that remote network instance. In this case, we called it remote network connection to B. Traffic is inspected as it enters in to Prisma Access. So if I have a user on the ground in remote network B, and they go up their IPsec tunnel and hit their security processing node, this is where traffic's going to be inspected. This is where we're going to match it to security policy rules. This is where we're going to do decryption, whatever it is we're doing. And if it terminates to some other component within Prisma Access, so in this case, remote network A, something else, the to zone, the destination, is going to show enter FW. So internal forwarding. It's being forwarded within Prisma Access. Now it's going to travel through Prisma Access to the RN SPN at site A, go down the IPsec tunnel, and the user at the other end or the device at the other end is going to get the traffic, respond back, and it's going to go back through. One thing to be aware of in Prisma Access, and if you think about it, it's just like it is on a physical firewall. On a physical firewall, as traffic comes in, as it ingresses, we inspect the traffic and we make a decision to forward it or not, and then forward it through the firewall to whatever the destination zone is. The device on the other side responds back. That response is part of the same session. So it hits the same security policy rule and goes through. Same thing really happens in Prisma Access, but you got to think of your Prisma Access cloud as being one big old firewall and the different SPNs as being interfaces on a firewall. So traffic ingresses comes into one of the SPNs. That's where we do our inspection. That's where we do our security. As it gets forwarded out another SPN into some other Prisma Access component, it's like it's hitting the destination zone. We don't inspect it again. And then the return traffic for that same session responds back and goes back down to the other client. But the point at which we inspect traffic in Prisma Access is when it enters into Prisma Access, when it comes from the ground up into the cloud, which is just like it is with the firewall. It hits the source interface and source zone. That's where we do security. But the naming convention is kind of strange, right? So the from zone is going to be whatever you name that remote network instance that you have. You might not want to name it something as long and complicated as we did here, but you certainly want it to be something that is human readable and makes sense to you and contextual. If traffic goes outside of Prisma Access, say a user on the ground goes through Prisma Access and goes out to the internet, goes and visits Facebook or whatever, then the to zone, the destination, is going to show untrust. So you won't see, even if you have security policy rules with explicit zone names in them, you're not going to see those zone names. You're going to see the, for remote networks, you're going to see the remote network name, and it's either going to be internal forwarding if it stays within Prisma Access, or if it's going out to the untrust side of the internet, it's going to show untrust. Now, lots of the other stuff you're still going to see. You know, the application, source and destination IPs, the action, do we allow this or deny this? session end reason, that sort of thing. You'll also see security policy rule name, that sort of that sort of information, which isn't viewable here on this slide, but it's there. What we did do is we had a couple of columns here just to illustrate, instead of seeing an ingress interface and an egress interface, like Ethernet 1/1 and 1/2, you see tunnel interfaces. And these tunnels are going to be the tunnels that you have created, or they could be tunnels that Prisma Access creates between different nodes or different pieces of Prisma Access that are automatically created. Very importantly, for your mobile users, in Panorama, we have global protect logs. Now, that's also with our on-premise firewalls if you're running newer versions of our operating system. But if you're running something a little bit older on your on-prem firewalls, you may not have seen these before. The global protect logs are going to show all of your mobile user information for logons and log-offs and information such as that, successful logins, problems with logins, all that information. And you're going to be able to see users attaching to portals, to the portal, as well as different gateways. You're going to see what stage they're at, the login stage or logout stage, or you may even see some before logon for people that are using pre-logon. You'll be able to see the username. You'll be able to see their host name, their public IP address, their host ID, authentication methods, and there are lots of additional columns that you have the ability to enable and disable to view the information that you want. Also, in the ACC, the Application Command Center, we have new tabs specifically for Global Protect, which in Prisma Access means your mobile users. So there again, you're able to see successful and unsuccessful connections. You can drill into these logs and drill back into the Global Protect logs and the traffic logs and user logs and all of that information. You are able to get information about your overall deployment of Prisma Access or Global Protect if you have a blended environment with on-premise gateways and Prisma Access gateways. You're able to see all of that. And you can see connection failures and help troubleshoot those and see the users and the reasons for the failures and things like that. So it pulls from those Global Protect logs or accumulates the same information, I should say. Oops, wrong direction there, folks, sorry. Also gives you information to be able to look at the endpoint distribution, like, hey, how many of my users are using Macs, how many are using Windows, what percentage, what overall, what Global Protect app versions are there, what authentication methods are being used. Lots of great detail about stuff like that. Since we have Global Protect logs, now you have the ability to create reports about your mobile users, your Global Protect users. Let me just pop that up here. And we'll go to our Panorama and take a little bit of a look. So the Monitor tab in Panorama is where all of your reports are. Now, if you look at your normal reports, you see application-based reports, traffic-based reports, threat-based reports, URL filtering, PDF summary reports, etc. We don't say anything there specifically for Global Protect users. But what you are able to do is under Manage Custom Reports is I can either go in and create a brand new custom report with all the different columns or fields that I want to look at. I just want to make sure that my database is going to use my Global Protect logs. And then, I can make a report that shows client operating system. I just pull it over to the right, the connection method that's being used, the username, the status, source user, perhaps. And I can build these reports. I can give them time frames and sort different ways, do top ends, top 10, top 25, top 100. I can group them all these different ways. So I can do that. But additionally, I could load a template, which gives me the ability to, it may take a moment to load here, to take any existing report, maybe spyware infected hosts, load that in as my template or my base report. And then again, I can go in with my Global Protect logs and add different mobile user information onto those. So you got two options to do that there. But it gives you a lot of insight. And again, with Prisma Access, probably the main driver here is your mobile users sitting at home and remotely and in airports and stuff like that. And you're trying to protect them and get information about those users. So the Global Protect logs give you the information to cull that information and report on it. Another tool that is going to be useful within Prisma Access and available through a link on Panorama is Prisma Access Insights. Insights is going to give you lots of information about your Prisma Access deployment. Gives you enhanced ability to understand what's going on. Information about alerts that are happening. Graphs about alerts over time. We can look at, say, for instance, your mobile user deployment, where your user base is coming from, how many mobile users are connected versus what you're licensed for. Any sort of alerts or version numbers or numbers of connected users over time. There's not a whole lot on this report. I just pulled it off a demo device that doesn't really have many mobile users, but it gives you some ideas as to what you might see. Oh, and Insights is available through Panorama. So if I pop up my Panorama again, we go to the Panorama tab, and we go into where all your Panorama stuff is, which is, your configuration is going to be under cloud services and configuration. Status is going to show you the status of your deployment. There's another field there for Insights. And when you click on Insights, it takes you to your Prisma Access deployment. It takes a few seconds to get there, but it takes you to your Prisma Access deployment and shows you some of those different reports that I was showing you. Something else I wanted to get into is system logs. One of the things you might be troubleshooting, especially when you're deploying Prisma Access initially, is going to be your IPsec tunnels. A couple things when you're working with Prisma Access. Within our templates, and as you add remote networks or service connections, things like that, we are going to have pre-configured IKE gateway settings and templates for your remote networks or your service connections, as well as IPsec tunnel settings. One hint to improve troubleshooting capability within Prisma Access that gives you the viewability or enhanced viewability of problems is making sure that the nodes up in Prisma Access, the IPsec terminations to your SPNs and your service connections, you enable passive mode on those. Not traversal if you need it. If there's stuff between there, it's going to be natting things. Otherwise, we don't do NAT through the tunnels. But more importantly, the enabling passive mode. What that does is that means that the IPsec peer on the ground at that remote office or at that data center where the service connection is going to have to initiate the phase 1 and phase 2 negotiation, which means that the device on the ground is the initiator. Prisma Access is the responder, and the responder gets all of the detailed troubleshooting logs that you might need. You're going to find these logs in the system logs. So under the monitor tab, you go all the way down to system logs. You can choose what device group you want to look at. So, troubleshooting something in my remote network. So I'm going to go to my remote network device group, or it's my service connection. I'll go to my service connection device group to sort of filter through the logs. And then you can also create filters. In this case, we made a filter for the type of VPN. So that I can filter out the noise. And I can concentrate just on in this case, my VPN, IPsec tunnels. And if I'm trying to troubleshoot an issue, when I see events with descriptions, I can look at the details of these descriptions. And they usually give you really good information for troubleshooting problems. This is also useful on on-premise firewalls, right? Some examples. Here we see one says, IKE phase 1 negotiation failed, no suitable proposal found in peers security association payload. Well, that means that's SA, that's security association. That automatically tells you it's your crypto profile. So they couldn't negotiate or couldn't find what they needed in the crypto profile. And you can always customize these if you're using our pre-configured ones or create them from scratch. Second example, IKE phase 1. So it's P1, phase 1. Negotiations failed, couldn't find the configuration for IKE phase 1 request for peer IP. So now this is a peer ID misconfiguration. Whatever they're sending us or whatever we're sending them, incorrect in what they were looking for. And the last one is a phase 2 negotiation failure. And again, it's the SA or Security Association payload. That tells you it's IPsec crypto profile, phase 2 profile. So as long as you remember to enable passive mode on those for the IPsec tunnel termination on those nodes up in Prisma Access, you're going to get this information. Otherwise, you're just going to see failures. Phase 1 failure, phase 2 failure. You're not going to have much useful information. You're going to have to go to that device on the ground to figure it out. So great troubleshooting best practice there. Another thing I wanted to show you, since you have to forward logs to Prisma Access, into Cortex Data Lake in order to see them, is I'd like to point out one or two other best practices on Panorama that I would do. So first of all, when you're looking at your security policy rules, there's those default rules. And you remember with an on-prem firewall, you have your intra-zone default and your inter-zone default, neither of which log by default. On a on-premise firewall, an intra-zone default rule would say, hey, traffic that starts in one zone and ends in the same zone, it's going to have an allow action. The interzone says, you know what, traffic that starts in one zone and ends in a different zone, it's going to be denied by default. And so then you would create rules to allow and deny different traffic, explicit allows and denies. Well, one thing to remember in Prisma Access is, even though this line for this intrazone default is hard-coded into Panorama, it's not really there in Prisma Access. So basically, if you don't hit an explicitly written rule, you hit that interzone default, and it's going to be denied. Well, if you're not logging on that rule, and I would do this on both rules, if you're not logging on the interzone rules or interzone, the default rules, and you're not setting those up to Prisma Access, you have no visibility into this phenomenon or what's hitting those rules. So you definitely want to go in to your default rules, go to the actions, and log. Typically log at session end. You also need a log forwarding profile for these, which you may not have thought of before with the default rules. And then that gives you the ability, if I look at my traffic logs here, to see all the stuff that's hitting the default rules that you would otherwise not have any information about. You know, if I'm on an on-premise firewall, there's some ways I can glean this information by looking at global counters and stuff like that. Well, you don't have the ability to go to those nodes, those Prisma Access components, and take a look at that stuff. So the only place you're going to be able to see it is in these logs, and only if you are actually logging on those default rules. Look at all the stuff that's hitting my interzone default rule on this. This is stuff I would not see if I didn't have my login turned on for those. One other thing is you do need to make sure, in order to see the logs, is that you are connected to Cortex Data Lake. That's one of the things you're going to see on the status here on Panorama. And you'll see a status light. And if you go in the details, it'll actually retrieve the certificate for you and make sure that you are currently connected correctly. When you deployed Prisma Access, you had a one-time password, an OTP, that you used to connect up to Cortex Data Lake. It's going to have to be reset or renewed on a regular basis. Or if something happens, like you lose Panorama and it comes back up after extended amount of time, you're going to have to reconnect. Well, how would you do that? First of all, under the configuration tab, there's in the service setup, there's the re-verify your account, which gives you the ability to put in a new one-time password. So you would go back to the customer support portal. You would go under assets and cloud services, find your Panorama device, and generate a one-time password for it. Copy that to your clipboard, and then you can paste it into Panorama. Now, these one-time passwords are only valid for 10 minutes. So, you know, it's not going to work very well if you cut and paste the one-time password to an email it to somebody in a different office, you know, unless they open it right away and do it. There's going to be a finite time frame there, 10 minutes. So you do want to be cognizant of that. But I did want to just kind of show you a couple of hints and tricks there for VPN troubleshooting and the default rules, enabling logging on those. And I would also put security profiles on your security policy rules. You know, you think about that, I think, on on-prem firewalls, but maybe not so much with Prisma Access. They're still important. Cloud-based logs. So let's say you're not using Panorama. You're using the cloud-based management tool to manage and deploy Prisma Access. This is designed for customers that do not use Panorama and do not use other Palo Alto Networks platform components. There's no interconnectivity between the cloud-based management tool and Panorama, or the cloud-based management tool and XDR or anything like that. It's a standalone product, which means you can't do things like copy over rules or import configurations and do stuff like that. It's designed for customers that don't have Palo Alto Networks yet. They don't need to go out and buy a Panorama. They can use this. It just doesn't have quite the functionality and cross-platform integration that Panorama does. But you still do have the ability to register customers, users for Prisma Access alerts within the cloud-based management tool. You can still view logs. There's a log Explorer that allows you to view the logs just as you would on Panorama, and you can create filters and things like that. And one other thing about Prisma Access when it comes to reporting is, you know, for your mobile users, you got their user ID already. There's nothing you have to do to set up user ID. Group mappings, however, if you want to create rules for groups, members of groups like the finance group versus the sales group or something along those lines, to get those group mappings, there's a cloud-based app at the hub, apps.paloaltonetworks.com, called Directory Sync Service. That's going to allow you to get LDAP groups, whether it's on-premise, say Active Directory servers, or Azure-based ones. So you can feed that information back up into Prisma Access and Panorama and be able to write rules for groups. There's a little more detail on how it gets deployed, but that is there. And this is usually important if you want any sort of group-based rules and group-based reporting within Prisma Access. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of good information and reporting best practices, dealing with the logs and the reports and forwarding logs to Cortex Data Lake, and of course, forwarding logs from Cortex Data Lake, some troubleshooting tips and tricks, and hopefully that gave people a little bit of information that you're going to find useful. It looks like we do have some questions. So let me take a look at some of these. Somebody asked about the tunnel interface numbers. Do those tunnel interface numbers change once an SPN is spun up? So those tunnels that are created between those nodes by Prisma Access, not the ones that you create from up here on the ground up to the Prisma Access SPN, they can, it's possible that they could change. The tunnel interface numbers could change, as well as some of the back end internal IP addresses. There is the ability to get that information. If you go back to Panorama, you do have the ability to basically generate an API key, go out and get all these sort of loop back internal interface IP addresses that you didn't see, that you don't really have visibility to get that visibility. And then you can be, you can do IP change event notifications to see what, to see if anything does change. So public IP addresses, your peers at your SPNs, your service connection, stuff like that, they're static. They're not going to change. Therefore, those tunnels will always be the same, but the internal meshing, it's possible it could. Somebody else asked, forwarding logs from Cortex using leaf format, LEEF, to a SEM. This line is added to forward logs. Oh, okay. So I think not so much that this was a question, but some information about customizing the log formatting to forward to different SEMs. And you do have the ability to do that, just like you do with on-prem firewalls. It looks like one of my coworkers, Karim, is actually handling that specific question for you, David. And one final one, it looks like, from Gary. When Panorama is pulling logs from Cortex Data Lake, what is the expected delay from the time of the event to the time that I can see in the traffic logs? So it's a little bit different, Gary, than forwarding logs, say, from an on-prem firewall, which is going to Panorama, where an on-prem firewall is basically going to burst the logs, and you may see a 30-second delay or something along those lines. What we're actually doing here is Prisma Access, or Panorama, is using an API hook. It's using a plugin, the API, to go and view the logs in the cloud. So Panorama is not downloading or pulling those logs. All it's doing is viewing them with an API call. They're going to be available as soon as they are generated by a security processing node and forwarded on to Cortex Data Lake. So you could expect to see basically that same sort of potential several second delay that you might see with an on-prem firewall. But the only thing I really wanted to point out there is that unlike uh, the logs living on Panorama or living on a log collector, they are up in the cloud. So you also have to think about any sort of latency or delay that you might see between your on-premise Panorama and the cloud instance of Cortex Data Lake. So hopefully that helped you out. I believe that took care of all the questions that we have. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining in. And I would like to invite you back on a regular basis, either live for these Prisma Access webinars, or of course, you can always view them, the recorded versions. But thank you everybody for attending. Have a great week, and we will see you next time.